It began as a welfare check, the kind of call that usually ends with a quick knock on the door and a routine report. But on the morning of October 29, 2019, something felt different. The dispatcher's voice over the radio carried an edge of urgency, detailing a string of suicidal text messages sent by a man named Jorge Cano. His friends had grown worried, one of them driving to his home to check on him. What they found left more questions than answers, and by the time I arrived, it was clear this was no ordinary case. The house was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. A faint metallic smell hit me first, blood, unmistakable. In the bathroom, the source of the stench came into view. Blood coated the edges of the bathtub, pooling in places where it had dried overnight. On the tub's rim were knives, their blades dulled by congealed streaks of red. Bloody towels lay crumpled on the floor, and beside them, clothing soaked through shorts, a shirt, each one bearing silent witness to something horrific. On the edge of the sink sat a phone, still buzzing with messages from concerned friends and family. Each unanswered vibration seemed to echo the absence of its owner. Something caught my eye: handwritten notes, scattered across the countertop. I picked one up with gloved hands, reading the words carefully. They were messy, hurried, the penmanship barely legible. The contents resembled a suicide note, or at least what someone might want us to believe was one. Each note told a story of regret, guilt, and despair. But something about the phrasing felt off, calculated, almost performative. I couldn't put my finger on it just yet, but the notes felt more like a script than a farewell. There was no sign of Jorge Cano. A neighbor's security camera provided our first lead, footage of a man fitting Cano's description leaving through the back door just before dawn. He carried something large, wrapped in what looked like a plastic bag, before loading it into a white rental truck parked in the driveway. He drove off minutes later, disappearing into the early morning haze. The house was unsettling enough, but it was nothing compared to what we found next. A few miles away, at an upscale apartment complex where Jorge and his girlfriend, Carmen Escalante, had recently moved, the story grew even darker. This was supposed to be a fresh start for them, a new chapter. Instead, it had become the epicenter of a nightmare. From the moment we entered the apartment, it was clear something violent had happened. Blood splattered the walls in uneven arcs, the kind that told a story of struggle and chaos. On the floor, personal items were scattered: Carmen's wallet, her keys, even a rosary. Each piece felt like a silent plea for someone to notice, to ask the right questions. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the violence that had occurred here still lingered, refusing to let go. The bathroom was the worst. Blood coated the tub in thick smears, pooling in the drain as though it had been rinsed but never cleaned. A large kitchen knife rested on the counter, its blade dull from use. The phone left behind buzzed with notifications, another haunting reminder of the lives disrupted by this unfolding tragedy. We worked in silence, each of us processing the scene in our own way. The forensics team swabbed the blood, confirming two distinct sources: one male, one female. The male blood matched Jorge Cano. The female blood, we feared, belonged to Carmen Escalante, but she was nowhere to be found. Neighbors were questioned, but no one had seen Carmen for days. Phone records revealed her last known location, a ping from Seminole County, Georgia, more than 200 miles away. A gas station surveillance camera provided our next lead. Jorge had been there making purchases with Carmen's phone. The footage showed him nursing an injury to his neck with a blue cloth, his movements jittery and frantic. Outside, his white rental truck sat in the parking lot, a dark plastic bag in the bed. The shape inside was unmistakable, horrifying. We pored over every detail, each piece of evidence dragging us deeper into the dark reality of what had occurred. It became clear that whatever had happened in that apartment was only the beginning. Jorge's movements suggested he had tried to cover his tracks, to erase the evidence of his crime. But the bloodstains, the notes, the footage, they refused to stay buried. The final piece of the puzzle was Carmen herself. Where was she? The question loomed over every discovery, every lead. Jorge's trail led us across state lines into Alabama, where U.S. Marshals tracked him down. He was still in his rental truck, the same one caught on security cameras. When they approached him, he opened fire, his desperation now spilling over into violence. The marshals returned fire, wounding him before taking him into custody. But even then, Carmen remained missing. 3 hours later, on a stretch of Highway 84 in Georgia, a suitcase was found. It lay discarded among the brush, unassuming at first glance. But the tag bore Carmen's name, and inside was the answer to our grim question. Her body had been dismembered, her remains stuffed into the suitcase alongside personal items, a rosary, men's watches, and the key fob to the rental truck. It was a sight that silenced even the most seasoned among us. The power cord around her neck spoke of strangulation. The blunt force trauma to her face told of a violent struggle, and the dismemberment told of a cold, calculated attempt to erase her entirely. Back at the station, I replayed the scenes in my mind. The blood in the apartment, the knives in the bathtub, the trail of breadcrumbs George had left behind, each one more damning than the last. This wasn't just a crime, it was a crescendo of violence, a symphony of horror that crescendoed with Carmen's final moments. And as I sat there, staring at the evidence laid out before me, one thought lingered: what could drive someone to such darkness? The answer, I knew, lay ahead. When we stepped into the apartment, it felt as though time had frozen. Every detail within those walls screamed of violence, desperation, and a story that could only end in tragedy. Jorge Cano and Carmen Escalante had moved here to begin a new life together. But the blood on the walls told a different story, a final chapter, written in chaos. The living room was a mess, with items scattered across the floor as if a struggle had erupted out of nowhere. A wallet and keys lay abandoned on the carpet, alongside personal effects that Carmen had likely carried with her every day. There was a rosary, small, delicate, and completely out of place in the macabre setting. The sight of it sent a pang of unease through me, as though it had absorbed the horror that had unfolded in this space. But the real horror was in the bathroom. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a scene that was almost too gruesome to process. Blood was smeared across the bathtub, dried in thick, sticky streaks that clung to the white porcelain. It pooled at the drain, a dark reminder of the violence that had occurred. A large kitchen knife rested on the countertop, its blade dulled and stained, its purpose unmistakable. Next to it were blood-soaked towels, tossed carelessly, as if even the effort to clean up had been abandoned halfway through. On the edge of the tub sat a pair of shorts and a shirt, both soaked through with blood. Their placement was oddly deliberate, as though Jorge had taken his time arranging them for someone to find. Nearby, a phone buzzed intermittently, vibrating with unanswered calls and messages. Each notification felt like a cruel taunt, a reminder of lives disrupted and a world outside these walls, oblivious to the horror within. The forensic team worked methodically, swabbing surfaces and collecting samples. 2 blood types were identified, 1 male, 1 female. We knew who they belonged to without needing confirmation. George's blood was in the mix, but it was Carmen's that painted the walls and stained the tub. The quantity alone told us she had likely suffered unimaginable pain before her death. Scattered throughout the apartment were handwritten notes. Some were stained with blood, the ink smudged and barely legible. The contents were consistent with suicide letters, written in a messy scrawl that hinted at desperation or a deliberate attempt to create the illusion of despair. The notes described guilt, regret, and pain, but they lacked authenticity. They read like a performance, carefully crafted to mislead whoever found them. We retraced their movements through security footage, piecing together the moments leading up to the violence. Just days earlier, Jorge and Carmen had been seen on camera at a gas station. They appeared happy, affectionate even, their actions betraying none of the darkness that would soon follow. But by the time they returned to the apartment, something had shifted. We could only speculate as to what had triggered the violence, a fight, perhaps, or a decision by Carmen to leave. Whatever it was, the outcome was carved into the walls of this apartment. The evidence spoke of a brutal struggle. Blood splatter patterns indicated that Carmen had fought back, her resistance fierce but ultimately futile. The sheer amount of blood suggested she had been injured severely, possibly fatally, before the final act of violence that ended her life. Her body wasn't here, but the trail of evidence made it clear she had been here, fighting for her life, until the very end. The kitchen knife found on the counter was later identified as the weapon used to dismember her body. The thought of it, the cold precision required for such an act, was almost too much to bear. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was something darker, more calculated. Jorge hadn't just killed Carmen, he had sought to erase her, to reduce her to something that could be hidden away in a suitcase, discarded like refuse. We knew Jorge had left the apartment early that morning. The security footage showed him loading something large into the back of his white rental truck. A plastic bag, stretched taut, hinted at the horrific contents within. He drove away quickly, disappearing into the pre-dawn light, leaving behind a blood-soaked apartment and a trail of clues that painted a damning picture. As we combed through the evidence, a chilling realization set in. George had taken deliberate steps to stage the scene, to manipulate the narrative. The notes, the knife, the scattered belongings, they were all part of his attempt to create confusion, to buy himself time. But no matter how carefully he had planned, the truth seeped through the cracks, refusing to be silenced. The apartment was empty now, its walls and floors echoing with the violence that had once filled the space. Carmen's absence was palpable, a haunting void that hung over everything. Somewhere out there, her remains awaited discovery, the final piece of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. And as we left the apartment, stepping back into the blinding Florida sun, one thought lingered in my mind: Carmen had fought for her life here. It was up to us to ensure her fight wasn't forgotten. The moment we left the blood-soaked apartment, the hunt for George Cano took on a desperate urgency. Every piece of evidence told us he wasn't just running, he was trying to erase every trace of the horrific crime he had committed. But for all his planning, his trail was anything but cold. He left behind a breadcrumb trail of recklessness and panic. The first breakthrough came from Carmen Escalante's phone records. Her phone had pinged in Seminole County, Georgia, hours after the apartment had become a crime scene. Surveillance footage from a Chevron gas station captured George using Carmen's phone to make 2 transactions late that night. His movements were deliberate but sloppy. At the register, he clutched a blue cloth tightly around his neck, covering an injury he had sustained, likely during the violent struggle with Carmen. His appearance was erratic, his body language jittery. Outside, his white rental truck sat in the parking lot, with a dark plastic bag barely concealed in the truck bed. The outline of what was inside was disturbingly human. Even more chilling was what the footage didn't show Carmen. She wasn't in the store, and there was no sign of her anywhere nearby. By this point, we weren't looking for her alive. We knew better than to cling to false hope. George had made sure of that. The trail picked up again in Alabama, where U.S. Marshals finally caught up with George 2 days later. He was still driving the same white rental truck, but when they attempted to apprehend him, he opened fire. A shootout erupted on the quiet streets of Saraland, Alabama, and George was taken down with non-lethal wounds. He was rushed to the hospital under heavy guard, his arrest offering a fleeting sense of victory. But one question remained: where was Carmen? We scoured the truck for answers. Inside, we found long strands of dark hair, Carmen's hair, and traces of blood smeared along the interior. But the dark plastic bag seen in the surveillance footage was gone. Somewhere along George's route, he had discarded it, like garbage tossed from a moving car. The thought sickened me, but it also sharpened our focus. His movements along Highway 84 gave us a narrow window to search. 3 hours later, the grim discovery was made. Along the highway, just outside Seminole County, Georgia, a discarded suitcase was found among the brush. It was worn but intact, with a luggage tag bearing Carmen Escalante's name still attached. Inside, the horror unfolded. Her body, or what remained of it, had been stuffed inside, her limbs dismembered in a crude and cruel attempt to conceal her identity. Alongside her were personal items: a rosary, 2 men's wristwatches, and a rental truck key fob. Each item was a testament to the brutal intimacy of the crime. A power cord wrapped tightly around her neck, the tool of her strangulation, was still in place. Her right arm had been severed entirely, placed in a separate heavy-duty garbage bag. The other limbs bore evidence of failed attempts at dismemberment. George had tried but abandoned the process, leaving a grotesque and incomplete act behind. The autopsy confirmed what we feared. Carmen had died from asphyxiation, her final moments marked by terror and pain. Blunt force trauma to her face told of a struggle, of resistance against the man she once trusted. The dismemberment wasn't just an attempt to hide the body, it was an act of violence so depraved it felt personal, a final expression of dominance and control over her. The suitcase was the ultimate betrayal, a cruel, careless disposal of a woman who had once been the center of George's life. It wasn't just evidence of a crime, it was a statement. George hadn't just killed Carmen. He had stripped her of her humanity, reducing her to an object he could discard on the side of the road. Back at the station, the mood was heavy. The evidence was overwhelming, and George's capture ensured he would face justice. But Carmen's story didn't end with her death. Each step of George's journey revealed a man who had carefully plotted her murder, but whose recklessness had betrayed him. From the apartment's bloodied walls to the gas station's surveillance cameras to the discarded suitcase along the highway, every misstep told the story of a man who couldn't outrun the consequences of his cruelty. We had pieced together the trail of deception Jorge had left behind, but it was impossible to shake the weight of what had been lost. Carmen wasn't just a victim. She was a person, someone who had once dreamed of a life beyond the chaos that ultimately consumed her. And as we prepared for the next phase of justice, the trial that would hold Jorge accountable, one thought remained clear: this wasn't just about evidence or conviction. It was about giving Carmen the dignity she had been denied, ensuring her voice wasn't silenced by the man who tried so hard to erase her. As the pieces of Jorge Cano's gruesome crime came together, the sheer depth of his betrayal began to surface. This wasn't a man who acted in the heat of passion. His actions were deliberate, his movements calculated though clumsy at times, and his lies carefully constructed to deflect blame. But the evidence, now laid bare, painted a story he couldn't outrun. The truth was closing in, and his web of deceit was unraveling with each passing day. The bloody scenes at both Jorge's house and the couple's apartment told a chilling story. Carmen Escalante had trusted him, likely believing she was stepping into a new chapter of their relationship. Instead, Jorge had planned her demise, turning what should have been a fresh start into a chamber of horrors. From the moment we entered those crime scenes, it was evident that this was no accident, no spontaneous outburst of rage. This was premeditated. The trail Jorge left behind revealed as much. The handwritten notes scattered at the apartment attempted to paint a picture of a man on the brink, suicidal, remorseful, consumed by guilt. Yet, they felt hollow, like a poorly written script designed to evoke pity. Jorge had intended for those notes to mislead us, to throw us off his trail and shift focus away from the murder. But they only raised more questions, highlighting the methodical nature of his planning. Then there was the surveillance footage. Jorge had made no effort to avoid detection. His presence at the gas station, using Carmen's phone to make purchases, was brazen. He clutched a blue cloth to his neck, hiding an injury that spoke to the struggle Carmen must have put up before her life was extinguished. The footage of his white rental truck, with the telltale plastic bag in the back, was damning. And yet, Jorge pressed on, discarding evidence along the way as though he believed distance alone could erase the monstrous reality of his actions. But Jorge's recklessness didn't stop with Carmen's murder. His behavior during his capture further unraveled the facade he had tried to build. When U.S. Marshals finally caught up with him in Saraland, Alabama, he opened fire, initiating a shootout. This act of desperation spoke volumes. Jorge wasn't just running from the law, he was running from the inescapable truth of what he'd done. His capture, though violent, ensured he would face the justice he had so desperately tried to evade. As we pieced together his timeline, the most damning discovery came with the suitcase. Discarded on the side of a Georgia highway, it contained not only Carmen's dismembered remains, but also the personal items that made the crime all the more intimate. A rosary, men's watches, and a rental truck key fob. These were the tokens of Jorge's attempt to tie up loose ends, to erase any trace of Carmen's identity and their shared life. But the suitcase didn't hide the truth, it revealed it. Carmen's body, reduced to pieces, told of a man who viewed her not as a partner but as a problem to solve, a life to extinguish and discard. The power cord wrapped around her neck was the tool of her death, a final act of dominance over a woman who had once trusted him. The failed attempts to dismember her further revealed Jorge's cruelty, his willingness to violate her, even in death, to conceal his crime. And yet, for all his efforts to manipulate, deceive, and erase, Jorge underestimated the inevitability of justice. The surveillance footage, the blood evidence, the discarded suitcase, every piece of his plan left a breadcrumb trail leading straight back to him. His lies, carefully constructed, began to collapse under the weight of undeniable truth. As we prepared for the trial, the weight of the case became heavier. Jorge's capture meant that Carmen's voice, silenced by his violence, would finally be heard in the courtroom. But it wasn't just about convicting Jorge, it was about restoring dignity to Carmen's memory, ensuring that her life wasn't overshadowed by the brutality of her death. The unraveling of Jorge Cano's lies was as much a testament to the evidence as it was to the unrelenting pursuit of justice. Carmen's story deserved to be told not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that even the darkest acts cannot erase the truth. And as we prepared to face Jorge in court, we knew that his lies had failed, his attempts to control the narrative shattered by the undeniable reality of his crime. Justice, though delayed, was inevitable. The trial of Jorge Cano was more than a criminal proceeding. It was an opportunity to restore Carmen Escalante's dignity, to remind the world of her humanity amid the horrific details of her death. The courtroom became a battleground where the evidence was laid bare, each piece unraveling Jorge's lies and bringing the truth into the light. Justice was the goal, but for Carmen's family, it was also a chance to speak for her, to ensure she was remembered not for the way she died, but for the life she lived. Prosecutors presented a case so meticulously built it left little room for doubt. Blood evidence from both crime scenes, the surveillance footage showing Jorge's chilling indifference, the notes he left behind, and the suitcase containing Carmen's remains all painted a picture of calculated cruelty. The power cord found around Carmen's neck and the blunt force trauma to her face revealed the depths of Jorge's brutality. The dismemberment, unfinished yet grotesque in its intent, showed his desire to strip Carmen of her identity and discard her existence. Throughout the trial, the prosecution made sure Carmen's story wasn't lost amid the gruesome evidence. Witnesses who knew her spoke of her kindness, her aspirations, and the vibrant life cut short by Jorge's actions. Although Carmen had little social media presence, those who loved her ensured the jury understood she was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, and someone who mattered deeply. The defense attempted to argue a narrative of emotional instability and desperation, but it crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Jorge's calculated actions before and after the crime, his attempts to clean the crime scenes, his use of Carmen's phone and credit cards, his decision to shoot at law enforcement destroyed any claims of impulsivity. This wasn't a man overcome by emotion. This was someone who planned and executed a horrifying crime with precision. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase that followed was marked by grim testimonies about the heinous nature of the crime. Prosecutors argued for the death penalty, citing the cruelty of Carmen's death and the aggravating factors of the dismemberment and fraud. Jorge sat emotionless as the judge recounted the evidence, his demeanor as cold and detached as the crime itself. Ultimately, Jorge Cano was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.